The wedding dress had been sewn for her sister. Ivy knew this because the bodice was too wide across the shoulders, the silk hem pulled 2 inches past her feet, and the seamstress had not once looked at her face while pinning the final alterations into place. The woman's mouth was full of needles and her eyes were full of Seraphine. Always Seraphine, the eldest, the bright one, the one whose laughter carried across 3 halls and still sounded like music. But Seraphine had a fever, and so the dress had been taken in at the sides, clumsily, with thread that did not quite match, and handed to Ivy with the kind of smile one gives a borrowed candle, useful for a moment, never truly one's own. "You will serve," her stepmother had said, smoothing the fabric over Ivy's collarbones with cool, efficient hands. "That is all that is required of you today. Stand. Pour. Do not speak unless spoken to. And for the love of the moon, do not let him look at you too long." Ivy had not asked why. She had learned long ago that the answers to questions like that one were never worth the cost of asking. The great hall of Dunmere Keep smelled of pine resin and candle smoke, and something older beneath it all, stone that had absorbed centuries of fear and ceremony and wolves. The banners of House Caldwell hung from the raftered ceiling, deep burgundy edged in gold, bearing the stag that her late father had chosen as their sigil. "A gentle creature," her mother had once said, running her finger along the embroidered antlers. "Your father always said a stag could run faster than a wolf when it knew where it was going." Her mother had been dead for 11 years, her father for 3. What remained was the keep, the title, and Lord Cedric Vane, stepfather, regent, and the man currently standing at the head of the receiving table with the particular posture of someone who had rehearsed his confidence in a looking-glass. Ivy stood to the left of the table, behind a low wooden cart bearing a clay pot of tea, 2 pitchers of cold water, and a tray of honey cakes that no one would eat. Her task was clear. Her position was clear. She was the background of this scene, the furniture of this meeting, the warm body behind the refreshments, while her 2 half-sisters, Seraphine, pale and feverish, propped upright by sheer vanity, and Cecily, the younger, dressed in amber silk that caught every torchlight, were displayed like jewels on a velvet cloth. The Alpha King had been invited to choose a bride from among the daughters of the noble houses. 3 invitations had gone out across the realm. 3 houses had answered. Dunmere Keep had presented 3 daughters, or rather, 2 daughters, dressed to be chosen, and 1 Omega girl in an ill-fitted wedding gown, pouring tea. Ivy poured the tea. She kept her eyes low, her hands steady, and her breathing measured. The clay pot was warm against her palms. The steam rose and curled and disappeared. She focused on the motion. Tilt, pour, set. Tilt, pour, set. And let the voices in the room wash over her like water over stone. She did not look at the door when it opened. She did not look up when the room fell silent. She felt the silence, though. It pressed against her skin like a change in weather, sudden and total, the way forests go quiet when something large moves through them. She kept pouring. Lord Vane. The voice was low, not loud. It did not need to be loud. It was the kind of voice that assumed the room would arrange itself around it. And the room did, every body in it subtly shifting, realigning, like iron filings near a lodestone. Ivy's hand slowed on the clay pot. She did not look up. AlphaKingRomance. Her stepfather's tone had shifted, smoother, higher, the voice he used when he wanted something. "We are honored beyond measure. Please, allow me to present..." In a moment. 2 words. Cedric Vane stopped speaking as though a hand had pressed flat against his chest. Ivy heard footsteps. Slow, even, unhurried. Boots on stone, each step deliberate. The sound moved across the hall and then stopped. She felt the pause like a held breath. Then she heard it, very quietly, directed toward her alone. "What kind of tea?" Ivy looked up. She had not meant to. Her eyes simply rose on instinct, pulled by the directness of the question, and she found herself looking at a man who stood less than 3 feet away, watching her with eyes the color of a winter sky at midday. Pale blue, clear, and entirely still. He was taller than she'd expected. Broader. The black fur mantle across his shoulders moved slightly with his breathing, and the leather armor beneath it bore the marks of actual use. Worn at the wrist guards, scratched along the chest plate, the belt buckle darkened with age. There were 2 thin scars at the left side of his jaw. His dark hair fell in long braids past his shoulders. He looked like a man who had never needed a room to arrange itself around him, because the arrangement happened regardless. He was looking at her. Not at Seraphine. Not at Cecily in her amber silk. Not at the table, or at Cedric Vane's carefully constructed display. At her. "Rosemary," Ivy said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "And a little dried lemon peel. It aids digestion after long travel." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, more like a notation, a small fact filed away. "Practical," he said. "I did not think flattery would serve you better than warmth, my lord." The silence in the room deepened to something almost physical. She heard Cecily make a small, strangled sound. She heard her stepfather's breath catch. She did not look at either of them. She was looking at Roman, AlphaKing of the Veldrath territories, lord of 11 packs, the man who had ended the border wars in 2 seasons, and had not yet chosen a queen in 32 years of rule. And he was looking back at her with an expression she could not read. "Your name," he said. "Ivy, my lord. I am—" She stopped herself before she said nobody. "The 3rd daughter of the house." "3rd?" he repeated. "Yes." He glanced once, only once, at Seraphine, who was attempting to straighten her spine with the careful effort of someone pretending not to be feverish. He glanced at Cecily, who smiled immediately, brilliantly, with all the practiced warmth of a girl who had trained for this moment. Then his gaze returned to Ivy, standing behind a tea cart, in a dress sewn for her sister, with mismatched thread at the seams, and 2 inches of silk folded under her feet. "I will speak with her," he said, and turned toward the high table. The room did not breathe for 3 full seconds. Then Cedric Vane laughed. A light, dismissive sound, the laugh of a man rapidly reassembling a plan that had just been upended. Of course. Though I must note, AlphaKing, that our eldest daughter Seraphine is—" "I know who your eldest daughter is," Roman said without turning around. "I said I will speak with Ivy." He sat. He waited. And Ivy, who had spent 23 years of her life being the background, the furniture, the warm body behind the refreshments, picked up the clay pot and walked forward, because there was nothing else to do, and because her hands, despite everything, were steady. She did not yet know what that steadiness would cost her. She did not yet know what had been planned for tonight, in the room beneath the keep, where her stepfather's correspondence was kept in a locked chest, letters that bore her name, a forged signature, and a price. She poured the AlphaKing his tea. And somewhere in the walls of Dunmere Keep, a bargain was already in motion, and she was the one being sold. The evening meal passed like a performance Ivy had not been given the script for. She sat at the far end of the table, placed there by her stepfather's deliberate arrangement, far enough from Roman that the distance felt like a message, and ate almost nothing. The trencher before her held roasted pheasant and herb bread, and a small bowl of preserved plums, and she moved the food around with the careful attention of someone who needed to appear occupied. Across the table, Cecily was laughing at something one of the king's advisors had said, her amber silk catching the candlelight like a flame cupped in cloth. Seraphine sat rigid and pale, her jaw set with the effort of appearing well, her untouched wine going dark in its goblet. Cedric Vane sat beside Roman and spoke without pause. Ivy watched her stepfather the way she had always watched him, quietly, from a distance, filing details the way a careful scribe files parchment. She noticed the angle of his lean, the frequency of his gestures, the particular rhythm of his speech that meant he was building toward something. She had grown up studying that rhythm. It was the only warning she ever received. Roman listened, or appeared to. His expression gave away nothing. He ate with unhurried precision, and he did not look at Cedric Vane when the man spoke to him, which seemed to unsettle her stepfather in a way that he was working hard to conceal. Once, only once, Roman looked down the length of the table, directly at Ivy. She dropped her gaze to her trencher. When she looked up again, he had returned his attention to the wine in his hand, and Cedric was laughing at something, and the moment had closed like water over a stone. She found the letter by accident. That was the truth of it, though she understood that no one would believe her, and that it would not matter anyway, because the contents of the letter would eclipse every other detail the moment she finished reading it. After the meal, the household had dispersed into the evening rituals. Servants clearing trestle tables, hounds circling near the hearth for scraps, guards rotating at the outer doors. Ivy had been sent to fetch a particular wool shawl for Seraphine, who had finally surrendered to her fever and retired early. The shawl was meant to be in the cedar chest at the end of the upper corridor, the one that also held linens and the household's winter cloaks. She had opened the wrong chest. The corridor was dim, lit only by a single torch bracket at the far end, and the two chests sat side by side in the shadows, nearly identical in their dark oak and iron fittings. She had lifted the lid of the left one and reached inside, and her fingers had found not folded wool, but parchment, a stack of it, bound loosely with cord. She should have closed the lid. She had been in enough trouble in her life to know that unopened things were sometimes the only protection available to her. But the top sheet had caught in her fingers when she moved to withdraw her hand, and it unfolded just enough for the torchlight to catch two things: her name, written in her stepfather's hand, and below it, a number, a sum, written in the notation used for trade agreements and property transfers. Ivy stood in the corridor for a long moment with her heart beating in her ears. Then she took the letter to the torch and read it. It was addressed to a man named Aldrich Voss. She knew the name, distantly, as one of the border lords who had contested the Caldwell land rights after her father's death. The letter was written in Cedric's careful, slanted script, and it was dated 4 days prior. It said that the matter of the Caldwell Omega daughter had been resolved, that she would be presented to the Alpha King as part of the evening's proceedings, not as a candidate for his consideration, but as a distraction, a quiet, unremarkable girl placed at the edges of the gathering to ensure his attention remained occupied while the real negotiation was conducted. It said that following the king's departure, Ivy would be transferred to Voss's holding under a contract of indentured service, framed as a voluntary arrangement, signed with a forged copy of her own hand. It said the price of the transfer was the Eastern Caldwell grain fields, the fields her father had left specifically to her, in a provision Cedric had spent 3 years attempting to have overturned. It said, in its final line, that the girl was an Omega without a wolf and without allies, and that no objection she raised would carry weight in any council in the realm. Ivy refolded the letter. Her hands were shaking now. She pressed them flat against her thighs and stood in the corridor and made herself breathe, because breathing was something she could control, and control was the only thing she had ever truly owned. She had known, in the abstract way one knows a wound is coming before the blade arrives, that her stepfather did not love her. She had known he saw her as an inconvenience, her father's daughter by a first wife, an Omega with no wolf shift, no political value, no beauty that announced itself across a room. She had understood that her presence in Dunmere Keep existed only because removing her openly would have drawn questions. But she had not known about the contract. She had not known she had already been sold. She put the letter back in the chest and closed the lid. She found the correct chest, retrieved Seraphine's shawl, and walked back down the corridor with the shawl folded over her arm and her expression the same as it always was, composed, quiet, slightly withdrawn, the expression that had made her invisible for 23 years. She delivered the shawl to Seraphine's chamber. She helped the maid adjust the blankets. She answered Seraphine's brief, disinterested questions about whether the king had seemed pleased with the evening. "I could not say," Ivy told her. "He is difficult to read." Seraphine closed her eyes. "He would have chosen me, if not for this fever. Everyone knows it." Ivy said nothing. She left the chamber and stood in the passage outside it and looked at the narrow window at the end of the hall, where the night beyond the glass was solid black and cold, and thought about what it meant that in 4 days she would be transferred to a border lord's holding like a parcel of land. Thought about the eastern grain fields her father had walked her through when she was 9 years old, his broad hand warm on her shoulder, his voice patient as he explained what each row meant, what each season required, how the soil remembered what was given to it. "These are yours, little one. Whatever else happens, these fields remember your name." She thought about her younger brother, Emmerich, 16 years old, currently fostered at a northern keep under Cedric's arrangement, an arrangement that kept him conveniently far from Dunmere and conveniently dependent on Cedric's goodwill for his safety and his lodging. She had not seen Emmerich in 14 months. His letters arrived sporadically, always brief, always careful, always carrying the particular tone of someone writing with another person in the room. She could not reach Emmerich. She could not contest the contract alone. She had no wolf, no pack, no political standing, and no allies within these walls except possibly the elderly cook, who sometimes left extra bread outside her door and pretended not to notice. She needed to think. She turned from the window and walked toward the staircase that led to the lower hall, where the guests had been given chambers for the night. She was not certain what she intended. She told herself she was only walking, that she had no plan, no request, no desperate and humiliating appeal forming in her chest. But her feet knew where they were going before she did. The guards outside the AlphaKing's assigned chamber were 2 of his own men. Not Dunmere guards, not Cedric's people. They were large and still and watchful, and they watched her approach without expression. She stopped 6 feet from the door. The older of the 2 guards tilted his head slightly. "State your name and purpose." "Ivy Caldwell," she said, "3rd daughter of this house." She paused. "I need to speak with the AlphaKing." "I understand it is late. I will wait as long as necessary." The guard's expression did not change. "The king does not receive visitors after nightfall." "I know," Ivy said. "I am asking anyway." A silence. Then, from behind the heavy oak door, a voice, low, unhurried, carrying easily through the wood. "Let her in." The guards exchanged the briefest glance. The older one stepped aside. Ivy pressed her palms flat against her thighs one more time, steadied her breathing one more time, and walked through the door. The chamber was not what she had expected. She had imagined, in the 3 seconds between the door opening and her feet crossing the threshold, something austere and commanding. A room arranged to project authority, the way her stepfather arranged every space he occupied. Maps on the walls, guards at the corners. The AlphaKing seated behind a heavy table like a man holding court even in private. Instead, there was firelight. The hearth was large, and the fire in it was generous, and Roman stood beside it with his fur mantle removed and his arms bare below the leather vest, studying a parchment that he held at an angle to catch the light. A single candle burned on the table behind him. The room smelled of pine smoke and cold stone and the faint, clean scent of leather that had been well cared for. His braids were still tied back, but looser than they had been in the hall, as though he had unfastened some of them and not finished the work. He did not look up immediately. He finished reading whatever was on the parchment, set it down on the table, and then turned to look at her. His pale blue eyes were the same in firelight as they had been in the hall. Steady, clear, and carrying the unsettling quality of attention that did not slide away from what it found. "You are shaking," he said. "I am aware," Ivy said. "I apologize. I will stop." "I did not ask you to stop." She pressed her lips together. The shaking was in her hands, mostly, and she had them clasped in front of her now in the posture she had learned as a child, when she needed to appear calm. It helped somewhat. It made the trembling less visible, if not less present. Roman moved to the table and pulled out the chair on the near side, not for himself. He set it at an angle toward the fire, and then stepped back, leaving the space between them wide and undemanding. "Sit," he said. Not an order. More like an offering made in the language of a man who did not often offer things. She sat. The warmth of the fire reached her immediately, and she had not realized until that moment how cold she had been standing in that corridor with the letter unfolded in her hands, the cold of the stone working up through her slippers and into her bones. Roman leaned against the edge of the table, arms crossed, and waited. He was very good at waiting. It had the quality of something practiced, a patience that did not fidget, did not prompt, did not fill silence with noise. Ivy looked at the fire. "I found a letter," she said. "Tonight, in a chest in the upper corridor." She told him what it said. She told him plainly, in the same tone she would use to describe the weather or the contents of a supply list. Not because she felt plain about it, but because plain was the only way she could get through it without fracturing. She told him about Aldrich Voss, about the indentured contract, about the forged signature, about the eastern grain fields her father had left her. She told him about the arrangement framing her as a distraction during the evening's proceedings, while the real transaction was conducted without her knowledge. She did not cry. She had cried once in front of Cedric Vane, when she was 12 years old, and he had dismissed her father's personal library to pay a debt she did not understand. She had promised herself, watching his expression while she wept, unmoved, faintly irritated, that she would never again spend tears in the presence of someone who would not be softened by them. She did not yet know whether Roman was such a person. But she did not cry. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted, a log settling, and the light moved across the planes of his face. "You came to me," he said finally. "Not a question. You are the only person in this keep who is not under my stepfather's authority. There are my own guards. Your guards follow your orders, not mine, and I did not think you would refuse to hear me." She paused. "I was not certain, but I did not think so." Something moved in his expression, brief, almost imperceptible, the way light moves on deep water. "Why?" "Because you asked what kind of tea it was," she said. "A man who wants only to be deferred to does not ask questions that do not matter to his position." Roman looked at her for a moment that stretched several seconds past comfortable. "The letter," he said. "Can you retrieve it?" "Yes." "It was returned to the chest. I did not want anyone to know I had found it." "Good." He moved from the table, unhurried, and took a candle from the mantel, lighting it from the fire. "Then we will retrieve it now. Tonight, before your stepfather has reason to move it." Ivy stood. "You believe me?" It came out more startled than she intended. He paused and looked at her over the candle flame. "You described the letter's notation system as the kind used for trade and property transfers," he said. "That is not a detail an invented story includes. And your hands have not stopped shaking since you came through that door, which suggests you are not performing distress, but managing it." A brief pause. "Yes, I believe you." Something in her chest loosened by a fraction. Not relief exactly, but the easing of a tension she had not realized was the thing holding her upright. They retrieved the letter, The corridor was empty, the household deep in the late-night rhythms of sleep and rotation, and Ivy led him to the chest without incident. Roman read it in full by candlelight, standing in the cold corridor with the kind of absolute stillness that she was beginning to recognize as his default state. Not blankness, but the quality of a man who gathered information before he responded to it. He folded the letter and placed it inside his vest. "My advisor will seal this before morning," he said. "It will be documented and witnessed. And then it becomes evidence in a formal grievance before the Territorial Council." He looked at her. "Your stepfather will not be able to claim forgery, because the letter is written in his hand and references Aldrich Voss by name, a man currently under investigation for unlawful land seizure in the Western Reaches." Ivy absorbed this. "You already knew about Voss." "I knew about Voss. Then tonight, the invitation to present daughters for consideration was partially a means of determining which houses were engaging in the kind of consolidation that requires an Omega girl to disappear quietly." His voice was level. "I did not expect to find the evidence handed to me by the girl herself." The corridor was very cold and very quiet. Ivy looked at this man, this king she had met 5 hours ago, and felt the ground shift slightly under her feet, not in collapse but in the disorienting way of solid earth after a long time spent on water. "My brother," she said. "Emmerich. He is 16 and fostered in the north under my stepfather's arrangement. If Cedric is exposed, he will be brought south," Roman said. "I will send riders at first light." The simplicity of it, the quiet, absolute certainty, struck her somewhere between her ribs. She nodded. She did not trust herself to speak for a moment. "You should return to your chamber," he said. "Appear unchanged in the morning. Eat your meal, speak as you normally speak. Give your stepfather no reason to move faster than he intends to." "Can I do that?" she said, and it was not quite a question. "You poured tea in a room full of people who intended to sell you," Roman said, "and none of them knew you had realized it. I think you can manage breakfast." It was such a precise and unexpected observation that she almost laughed. A short, startled breath that was not quite humor and not quite grief, but somewhere in between, the sound a person makes when they have been seen so accurately it almost hurts. She turned to go. "Ivy." She stopped. "Lock your door tonight." She looked back at him in the dim corridor, this quiet and immovable man holding a candle, and she thought that she had spent 23 years being managed by people who wanted her small, and that this was the first time she could remember someone managing a situation for her instead. "I always do," she said. She walked back to her chamber. She locked the door. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed in the dark and pressed her still trembling hands flat against the wool blanket and stayed there until the trembling stopped. It took a long time, but it stopped. Morning came gray and cold, the kind of morning that arrived without ceremony, pressing flat light through the leaded window panes and laying it across the floor in pale, indifferent strips. Ivy rose before the household stirred. She washed her face in the basin, braided her hair with the same practiced hands that had done it 1,000 times before, and dressed in her plainest linen gown with the brown leather belt her father had given her. Narrow, worn smooth at the buckle. The one thing of his she had managed to keep through every reduction Cedric had made to her belongings over the years. She looked in the small polished mirror above the basin and saw what she always saw. A quiet face, a composed face, the face of a woman who had learned to take up very little space. She went down to breakfast. Cedric was already at the table. He looked up when she entered, and something in his expression ran a quick, invisible calculation before settling back into the pleasantness he kept on the surface like a well-maintained coat. "Ivy, you look rested." "I slept well, thank you," she said, and sat and reached for the bread. It was the finest performance of her life. She ate. She answered questions put to her in the mild, deflecting way she had perfected over years. She watched Cecily arrange herself at the far end of the table in a gown the color of new cream, clearly having received some instruction the night before about the importance of the morning's impression. Seraphine did not come down. Her fever had worsened, a servant reported, and she would remain in her chamber. Roman entered the hall with 2 of his advisors at 1/4 the breakfast hour. He moved through the room the same way he had the night before, without performance, without announcement, simply present in a way that rearranged the room around him. He nodded to Cedric, exchanged brief words with the senior Dunmere steward about the morning's arrangements, and took his seat at the high table. He did not look at Ivy. Not once. It was so deliberate and so perfectly managed that she felt a complicated rush of something she did not have a name for. A trust, perhaps, or the recognition of trust being offered in action rather than words. Cedric, she noticed, was watching Roman with the focused attention of a man waiting for a signal he had not yet received. His plan, as she understood it, had involved the AlphaKing departing today, after which the machinery of the contract with Voss could be set in motion quietly. He was waiting for Roman to make noises of departure, to thank the house, to sight the road, to take his leave with the graceful finality that would leave Cedric free to proceed. Instead, Roman set down his cup and said, "I will require use of your council chamber this morning, Lord Vane. I have correspondence to conduct before I can determine my road." Cedric's pleasantness did not flicker. "Of course, the chamber is entirely at your disposal. I will also need your sealkeeper and 2 witnesses drawn from the household, independent of your personal staff if possible. The senior steward and the head of your household guard should suffice." A pause. Barely a breath, but Ivy caught it. "Naturally," Cedric said. "I will arrange it." She was called to the council chamber an hour later. She had expected it, had been expecting it since she rose. But the knock at her chamber door still arrived like a stone dropped into still water, the impact spreading outward, even when the surface looked calm. The guard at the door was one of Roman's men, not a Dunmere guard, and he escorted her down the corridor without explanation. The council chamber was a long room with stone walls and a narrow window that looked out onto the inner courtyard. A fire had been lit in the hearth. The senior steward, an old man named Perrin, who had served her father before Cedric's arrival, stood near the wall with the careful posture of a man who had been told to witness something and intended to do so with his full attention. The captain of the household guard stood beside him. Cedric Vane was already in the room. He turned when Ivy entered, and for the first time in her memory, she saw something crack in his composed surface. Not dramatically, not enough that a stranger would notice, but she had been reading that face for 11 years, and she saw it. A tightening at the eyes, a fractional adjustment of his jaw. Roman stood at the head of the table. Beside him, a narrow-faced man in a gray travel cloak, one of his advisors, held a sealed document and a recording ledger. "Sit, please," Roman said, and he was looking at Cedric, not at Ivy. They sat. Ivy took a chair near the steward Perrin. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the table and breathed. "I will be direct," Roman said. He had not sat. He stood at the head of the table with his hands resting lightly on the surface, and there was nothing threatening in his posture. Nothing raised, nothing hard. It was somehow worse than aggression. It was the stillness of a man who did not need to threaten, because the facts would do it for him. Last evening, correspondence was discovered on these premises. Correspondence bearing your seal and signature, Lord Vane, addressed to Aldrich Voss, concerning the unlawful indentured transfer of Ivy Caldwell, a freeborn noble daughter, in exchange for the Eastern Caldwell grain fields. Lands bequeathed to her by her father's legitimate will. The room was absolutely silent. Cedric's mouth opened. "I cannot imagine what—" "The letter is documented and sealed by my own advisor and witnessed by 2 members of my guard," Roman said. "A copy has been dispatched this morning to the Territorial Council. Another has been sent to the High Record Hall in Veldrath." He paused, a single measured beat. I would caution you against the word imagine. Cedric's gaze moved very briefly to Ivy. She looked back at him. She had imagined this moment, in the abstract way one imagines hypothetical justice, distant, theoretical, never quite landing in the body as real. But it was real. It was happening in a cold stone room with a fire in the hearth, and old Perrin standing against the wall, and the man who had sold her sitting 4 feet away watching the architecture of his plan come apart. And she felt, not triumph, not yet. Something raw, the particular ache of a wound being cleaned. Necessary pain. The forged contract of indenture, Roman continued, will be presented alongside testimony from Aldrich Voss's own correspondence with 3 other houses, which my investigators have been compiling for the better part of 2 seasons. Your arrangement with Voss is not the first of its kind. It is, however, the one that will anchor the formal case against him, and against those who served as his instruments. Cedric said, very quietly, You planned this. I came to determine which houses were engaged in unlawful consolidation through the manipulation of Omega-ranked nobles, Roman said. I did not plan to find the evidence presented to me before the evening meal was cleared. A silence. The Caldwell lands, Roman said, including the eastern grain fields, will be placed under territorial protection pending a full review of all transfers conducted since Lord Caldwell's death 3 years ago. Dunmere Keep itself will be administered by an appointed steward during that review. He looked at Cedric with his pale blue eyes, level and without heat. You will not leave these walls until the council's investigators arrive. Lord Perrin will oversee the arrangement. Perrin against the wall, straightened slightly. He was trying very hard not to show that he was moved. He was not entirely succeeding. Cedric looked once more at Ivy, a long, measuring look, the kind that was meant to remind her of her smallness, her lack of wolf, her years of silence and compliance. The look that said, You are nothing, and you were nothing, and whatever this is, it will not last. Ivy met his gaze and did not look away. She thought of her father's hand on her shoulder in the grain fields. She thought of Emmerich's careful, guarded letters. She thought of the seamstress who had pinned a borrowed wedding dress onto her body without once looking at her face. She thought of herself, standing behind a tea cart, invisible, useful for a moment, never truly one's own. And then she thought, not anymore. She did not say it aloud. She did not need to. Cedric saw it in her face. Whatever it was, the thing that had replaced the quiet and the downcast gaze. And for just a moment, behind the contempt in his eyes, she saw something else. Recognition. Belated and bitter. The recognition of a man who had miscalculated the value of the thing he had discarded. She rose from her chair and walked out of the council chamber with her head level and her hands still at her sides, and the door closed behind her on that room and everything in it. And she stood in the corridor and pressed her back against the cold stone wall and breathed. 3 long breaths, in through the nose, out through the mouth. Then she heard the door open beside her and felt, before she saw, the particular quality of stillness that meant Roman had followed her out. He stood a few feet away. He did not speak. He simply stood, as though being present were a form of language he was fluent in. My brother, she said after a moment. The riders you mentioned. Left before dawn, he said. He will be here within 4 days if the road holds. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, opened them again. Thank you, she said. The words were wholly inadequate, and she knew it, and she said them anyway, because they were what she had. Roman looked at her, the way he had been looking at her since the moment she poured his tea, with the quality of attention that did not ask her to be smaller or larger than she was. There is something else, he said. His voice had shifted, still low, still even, but with something underneath it that she had not heard before, a careful, deliberate quality, like a man choosing each stone before he puts his weight on it. The reason I came to Dunmere, he said, It was not only the investigation. Ivy looked at him. "I have been searching," he said, "for some time, for a particular scent, a mate mark, something my wolf has been restless toward for longer than I will admit." A pause. "When I walked into that hall last night and you were standing behind the tea cart, I knew." The corridor was very still. "I am not asking anything of you," he said immediately, and the speed of it told her he had prepared for her fear, had thought about it, had decided in advance to address it before it could grow. "I am not using this as leverage. I am telling you because you deserve the truth, rather than a courtship that conceals its origins." His eyes were steady on hers. "You have had enough of people who concealed their intentions." Ivy stood against the cold stone wall and looked at this man who had read a letter in a dark corridor and sent riders before dawn and dismantled her stepfather's plan in a council chamber before the morning was half over. And she thought about what it meant that the word mate was the one word she had never wanted to hear again after a lifetime of watching pack bonds used as chains. She thought about what it meant that he had told her now, in a corridor, without arrangement, without ceremony, without the performance of a man who expected the revelation to win something. "I need time," she said. "I know," Roman said. "I do not know how much." "I know that too." She looked at him. "You are very certain of things you cannot control." "No," he said quietly. "I am patient with them." The distinction landed with quiet precision somewhere in the center of her chest. She pushed off from the wall. "Then I suppose," she said, "that we will see." She walked down the corridor toward the light of the keep's main hall, and she did not look back, and she did not need to, because she could feel him standing there, still, patient, present, and the feeling was not a chain. It was the first thing in a long time that felt like ground beneath her feet. Emmerich arrived on the 4th day, as Roman had promised. Ivy heard the horses before she saw them, the rhythm of hooves on the frozen road outside the keep walls, 3 riders moving at pace, and then the sound of the gate drawing open and voices she did not yet recognize. She was in the upper corridor when it happened, carrying a stack of linen she had offered to help sort, because her hands needed something to do, and the waiting had been its own kind of labor. She set the linen down on the chest, the correct chest this time, and walked to the window that overlooked the inner courtyard. She saw him dismount. He was taller than she remembered, 16 now, and the months of it had stretched him, broadened his shoulders slightly, though he was still lean in the way of boys who have not yet fully grown into themselves. His hair was the same warm brown as their father's, and he moved with the same careful, measured quality that she recognized because she had grown up watching it in herself. The posture of someone who had learned to be thoughtful about where they placed their weight. He looked up at the keep. Then, he looked up further, at the windows, with the particular searching quality of someone who knows the person they are looking for is watching. Ivy did not wait for him to find her. She was already moving. She reached the courtyard in less than 2 minutes, which she knew because she counted her steps the way she counted her breaths when she needed something to hold on to. She came through the low door at the side of the great hall and into the cold air, and Emmerich turned at the sound of the door, and then she stopped walking because he was already crossing the distance between them, and she had not prepared herself for how young he still looked, and how tired. He reached her, and she put her arms around him, and he stood there for a moment, stiff, startled, then not, and pressed his face briefly against her shoulder, the way he had when he was small, before Cedric's fostering arrangements had taught him to keep himself contained. "Ivy?" he said, muffled. "I know," she said. "I know. It's all right." It was not all right, not entirely, not yet, but it was becoming all right, which was a different thing, and in her experience, the becoming was what mattered most. The Territorial Council's investigators arrived 6 days after that. There were 4 of them. senior officials bearing the seal of the Veldrath crown, riding under Roman's colors. They came with scribes and a record keeper and a cart full of ledgers, and they spent 3 days in the council chamber with Perrin and the household records, and then they spent 2 more days in correspondence with the capital. Cedric Vane did not leave Dunmere Keep during this time. He was not imprisoned. That would come later, formally, with the weight of the council's full finding behind it. But he was confined to the keep and attended always by 2 of Roman's guards, and the particular quality of that attendance made the distinction between confinement and imprisonment largely theoretical. He did not attempt to speak to Ivy. She did not seek him out. Aldrich Voss was taken into custody at his border, holding on the 7th day. Ivy learned this from Roman's advisor, a quiet man named Gideon with ink-stained fingers, and an economy of language she found restful. Gideon delivered information the way a careful scribe delivers parchment, without embellishment, without the performance of importance, simply as the thing itself. Voss has confirmed the arrangement in exchange for reduced charges, Gideon told her. His testimony, alongside Lord Vane's correspondence and the forged contract documents, constitutes sufficient evidence for the council's formal ruling. And the grain fields? Restored to your name, pending the seal of the review's conclusion, estimated within the fortnight. He paused. The full review of land transfers since your father's death has also uncovered irregularities in the management of a timber holding in the northern reach, which appears to be connected to young Lord Emmerich's fostering arrangement. The council will address this as part of the same ruling. Ivy sat with this information for a long moment. Thank you, Gideon, she said. He nodded once, precisely, and withdrew. She walked to the window of the small sitting room where she had taken to spending her mornings, a room she had avoided for years because it had been her stepmother's favorite, and its association with that woman had made it feel contaminated. But her stepmother was gone now. 2 years passed, from a winter fever that had taken her quickly, and the room was only a room. A stone hearth, 2 wooden chairs, a narrow window overlooking the kitchen garden where the herb beds were brown and frost-edged in the winter cold. Her father had planted those herb beds. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the window and looked at them and felt, not the rawness of the council chamber morning, not the specific ache of a wound being cleaned. Something quieter, something that did not have a sharp edge. She thought it might be the beginning of peace. Roman found her there, as he had taken to finding her, without announcement, without design, simply present in the way that she had stopped startling at and had begun, without quite meaning to expect. He carried 2 cups of something warm. He set one on the narrow ledge beside her, without asking whether she wanted it. She looked at him. He looked out the window at the frost-edged herb beds. The council's lead investigator tells me the ruling will be complete before the new moon, he said. Gideon told me about the timber holding, she said, and Emmerich. The fostering arrangement will be dissolved. He can remain here, or travel to Veldrath under my household's care, or go wherever he chooses once the ruling is sealed. The choice will be his. He is 16. 16 is old enough to have preferences, Roman said. Whether he is old enough to act on all of them is a different matter, but the preferences deserve to be asked for. Ivy picked up the cup. The warmth of it moved through her palms and up into her wrists, and she thought absurdly of clay pots and rosemary tea and a great hall full of people who had not noticed her, and one man who had asked what kind. You have been patient, she said. I told you I would be. I know. She turned from the window to look at him properly. He was watching her, as he often was, with those pale blue eyes that did not ask her to arrange herself differently for their benefit. I have been thinking about what you said. In the corridor. He waited. I spent a long time believing that things like mate bonds and pack loyalty were simply other names for the same arrangements, she said. Other shapes of the same transaction. Someone wanting something from you and calling it love to make you easier to take. I know, he said quietly. I am not certain I have stopped believing it entirely, she said. I want to be honest with you about that. I would rather you be honest with me about it than certain before you are ready. She looked at him. This man who had read a letter in a dark corridor and sent riders before dawn and told her the truth about the mate bond when he could easily have waited, when waiting would have given him every advantage. This man who brought warm cups to cold windows and stood beside her without filling the silence with demands. I am not afraid of you, she said. I want you to know that. Whatever else is true, I am not afraid of you. Something moved in his face. Not the almost smile she had seen in the great hall on the first evening, but something deeper and less guarded. That matters to me more than you know, he said. I think I am beginning to, she said. The frost-edged herb beds were very still outside the window. The fire in the small hearth had burned low but held. I would like to try, she said. I cannot promise you what I will find on the other side of trying, but I would like to begin. Roman looked at her for a long moment. That is all I have ever wanted, he said. The beginning. Everything else is just time. The council's ruling came sealed on a Tuesday, delivered by Gideon into Ivy's hands at the table where she sat with Emmerich after the morning meal. It was thorough. It restored the eastern grain fields and the timber holding to the Caldwell name. It dissolved all contracts and arrangements made by Cedric Vane in his capacity as regent, finding his regency itself to have been obtained through misrepresentation of her father's final wishes. It formally censured Aldrich Voss and referred his case to the High Territorial Court. It appointed Old Perrin as interim steward of Dunmere Keep, while Ivy, as the legitimate heir, determined her intentions for the property. Cedric Vane departed Dunmere 3 days later under guard escort, heading to Veldrath to answer formally before the Territorial Council. He did not speak as he left. He walked through the courtyard with the stiff, diminished posture of a man carrying a weight he could not set down, and he climbed into the covered cart without looking back. Ivy watched from the upper window. She felt Emmerich come to stand beside her, taller than she'd remembered, quieter than she would have liked, with the guarded quality that would take time and patience to soften. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He covered it with his own, briefly, and they stood together and watched the cart move through the gate. It is done, Emmerich said. Most of it, she said. The rest will take time. He nodded. He understood time. They both did. She married Roman on a morning in early spring, when the herb beds her father had planted were coming back with the particular stubborn insistence of things that knew they belonged to the ground they grew in. It was not a large ceremony. She had not wanted large. She had wanted honest, a witness declaration in the keep's small stone chapel, with Emmerich standing at her left, and old Perrin standing at her right, and Roman across from her, with his dark braids loose at his shoulders, and his pale eyes entirely steady on her face. She wore her own dress, not Seraphine's altered silk, not anything borrowed or ill-fitted. A dress of deep green wool that she had chosen herself, with her father's leather belt at her waist, worn smooth at the buckle, the one thing she had kept through every reduction. Roman took her hands in both of his and held them without gripping, the way he held everything, present without possessing, sure without demanding. The vows were simple. She meant every word. Afterward, in the courtyard, Emmerich shook Roman's hand with a seriousness that made Ivy's chest ache in the best way, the way that comes from watching someone you love choose dignity. Perrin wept without apology, and did not bother to hide it. The kitchen staff had made honey cakes, the good ones, with dried fruit pressed into the tops, and someone had hung cloth in the Caldwell colors from the keep's inner walls, deep burgundy, edged in gold. The stag on the banner turned gently in the spring wind. Your father always said a stag could run faster than a wolf when it knew where it was going. Her mother's voice, 11 years quiet, in the back of her memory like a flame that had never quite gone out. Ivy looked at Roman. He was watching her with that expression she had learned to read, the one that was not quite a smile, but meant something more permanent than a smile. something that did not require the performance of happiness because it simply was. "Ready?" he said. She thought about what the word meant. Not readiness as the absence of fear, not readiness as certainty or wholeness or the completion of healing. Readiness is choice. Readiness is the decision to move forward with all the weight of what had happened still present, still real, still hers, and moving forward anyway. She thought of herself behind the tea cart. Invisible. Useful for a moment. She thought of herself here. "Yes," she said. She took his hand. The gate of Dunmere Keep opened onto the spring road, and beyond it, the fields. Her father's fields, the ground that remembered her name, were waking green at the edges, slowly, the way all true things wake. Without announcement, without permission, simply because the season had arrived and the roots were deep enough to hold. She walked forward. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her that she had not already faced, and everything ahead was hers to choose. Cedric Vane was found guilty by the Territorial Council before the summer solstice and stripped of all titles and holdings. He lived out his remaining years in a modest warden's post in the far eastern reaches, under permanent supervision, far from any land that had once carried the Caldwell name. Aldrich Voss was sentenced to 5 years of custodial confinement and the full surrender of all lands obtained through unlawful means. He never held territory again. Emmerich Caldwell came into his full majority the following year. He chose to remain at Dunmere for a time, learning the management of the grain fields under Perrin's patient guidance, before eventually traveling to Veldrath, not under obligation, not under anyone's arrangement, but because he wanted to, which made all the difference. Perrin served as Dunmere's steward until the spring after the wedding, when he retired to a small cottage at the edge of the kitchen garden and spent his mornings in the herb beds, tending the things that grew there with the unhurried devotion of a man who had waited a long time to tend only what he loved. And Ivy, once invisible, once sold, once the girl behind the tea cart in the borrowed dress, became Luna of Veldrath, not because the title was given to her, but because she had walked through every door that had tried to close against her and had come out the other side still herself. Clear-eyed, steady-handed, and entirely, irrevocably her own.